find a global entry.
Just do a clap, and then we can begin as you please.
I'm just gonna put some coffee. Sugar, milk, we have some, but just take your time. And
into that camera over there. Okay. Hi, and welcome to Central Questions. This is a podcast series hosted by me, Stefan Ingves. I'm the longtime former governor of the Swedish Central Bank. Today we're going to talk about what has happened in the corporate sector over the past probably 100 years, or more than that, and why is it that some of the corporates just seem to get bigger and bigger relative to the size of the economy. And today, to help us go through all of this, we're glad to have Yueran Ma from the Chicago Boot School with us. And you know a lot about this, but before we get into the details of this conversation, I would like you to say a few words about yourself and also some comments on the research that you have done, which of course stretches way beyond today's topic. So please.
Thank you very much for having me. March 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. So I suggested some of the topics that we will discuss today in honor of this very important occasion of this landmark publication that really influenced economics for 250 years. And today I would like to talk a little bit about what has changed, what's really different from the world of Adam Smith. So for myself, my name is Yueran Ma. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. Sometimes when people ask me what I work on, I joke that I study the relationship between Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Well, of course, these days we do not publish papers about Adam Smith and Karl Marx, so what I do specifically is to study firms and production activities. For example, how production is implemented by companies, the extent to which large versus small firms drive economic activities, how innovations happens in companies, the extent to which innovation requires young firms or old firms, and also how firms finance their production activities and the extent to which they raise money through pledging physical assets or their cash flows. And so how does this connect to this big theme of Adam Smith and Karl Marx? Well, one of the key issues in The Wealth of Nations is the power of decentralized system. And one of the key themes of Das Kapital or Marx is the power of centralized system. And firms is an interesting in-between state. They exist in a decentralized market system, and they're disciplined by this market system. But within firms, they're organized more like a planning system. They're governed by what economists sometimes call the visible hand. So by understanding things that companies do, you can actually understand a lot about the power and limitation of centralization and decentralization, which in some ways reflect on the broader organization of production and organization of society. And this is also somewhat personal to me, and over time my research has grown to be a reflection of things in my life. I grew up in China. My parents grew up in the Cultural Revolution, and they lived through high communism, and they came of age during China's economic transformation, and they were very influenced by it. And my mother in particular was a very big fan of Ronald Coase, who was one of the Chicago School economists who received the Nobel Prize for his work about the nature of the firm and also transaction costs and the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of organizing economic activities. And so my parents lived through these dramatic contrasts of different economic systems and the transformation. And also my mother's inherent curiosity has led to many insights that influenced me. But of course, personally living through these times is not difficult, and there are long shadows of historical events, of many personal losses as a consequence. So I feel a lot of what I do is to study things that she had so much talent for and no opportunity to do. And in all this history, I've had predecessors in my family who had sympathies to both markets and planning, like my mother's father was a big Marxist. He said in his retirement that he would spend every day reading Das Kapital, and my mother tried to convince him to read Greg Mankiw's Principles of Economics and had no effect. And well, he passed away, so I can't really ask him these questions about the power and limitation of different systems. But I learned a few years ago from Chicago law school colleagues that Ronald Coase' original work that influenced my mother, The Nature of the Firm, was inspired by Lenin, in the sense that when Ronald Coase was a student at LSE, there were a lot of debates in the West about whether central planning is feasible. And Lenin was claiming that the Soviet Union should be run by one giant company, and the Western economists were skeptical. But then Coase thought to himself, in the West, it's not no planning at all. You have firms, you have some amount of planning, and it's something in between. So why is it in between? Not one extreme of complete markets, not the other extreme of complete planning. And so that question, I think, is still really relevant today. Today, when people talk about AI, for example, like, will one algorithm rule everything? Will actually we overcome like the Hayekian information limitations of society, and whether the power of the visible hand is really being so much stronger now with technology? So all these themes that actually originated from things like The Nature of the Firm continue to play out in many different ways. And so my research, which is about empirical analysis of what firms can and cannot do, eventually leads me back to some of the historical developments that have influenced me personally and my parents and my grandparents.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful description of why you do what you do and what you have done by now for quite some time. It's very special, actually, to sit here and talk to you today, because we're writing March 2026, and that means that it's exactly 250 years since Adam Smith actually published The Wealth of Nations. And that was kind of a starting point when it came to thinking about a society or an economy in a different way compared to what was done before, because he was clearly into thinking about companies and things like that, and not just building monuments and other things of that type. But given that you have studied all of this, and given that you and your colleagues have collected and assembled over the years an enormous database when it comes to these things, if you were in the shoes of Adam Smith, and then you show up at the Stockholm School of Economics, and then you listen to a lecture today, or you talk to people in the corporate sector here, what do you think that Adam Smith would have thought?
He might even be surprised by the whole experience of coming to Stockholm. Flying with airlines, these are very large corporations, very large business operations. Landing in the Stockholm airport yesterday, I saw these like gigantic ads by Ericsson. One that Stockholm is the birthplace of mobile communications, to they're really investing heavily in the AI revolution. And AI in some ways is, at least to me, maybe the staunch Smithian followers may disagree, but AI to me is in many ways very anti-Smithian. So again, the core idea of Wealth of Nations is the power of decentralization, how markets can bring together these anonymous bakers, butchers, brewers in a way that facilitates coordination through the price system. It is really a lot about a system of small producers doing their own thing, and then the market channeling their energies together, incentivizing them to do what they're supposed to do. That element, of course, is still really important in the modern economy. But in the modern economy, we have these gigantic business organizations that are coordinated in a very different way from the Smithian market system. It's, in a way, much more centralized as production units. And Walmart, for example, the output of Walmart is, in some sense, greater than half of the world's countries. And Walmart internally is governed much more through top-down command and control, and AI is also a much more top-down system. And so I wonder how Adam Smith will think about these extremely large-scale production units or firms today. Like in the US, the largest 1,000 companies account for half of US output. In our research, we find that in the US, the largest 1% of companies used to account for 50% of production 100 years ago. Now they account for 80% of output, 90% or 97% of assets. And so this amount of centralization of production in large business organizations, to me, is quite interesting and sheds light on some of the elements that Adam Smith didn't quite think about. So in corporate governance, we often recite a line from The Wealth of Nations when Smith talked about large businesses at his time, which were mainly joint stock companies that were chartered by the government to some extent, and then some banks. And when he talked about these companies, he would say, because of agency problems, the managers don't take care of their investors, that negligence and profusion would prevail, and these joint stock companies often fail. And so he might also find it interesting that companies like Walmart or Ericsson can function, and actually in some sense function well, in that they can be efficient and can be successful in doing what they do. Not forever. Large companies come and go, they rise and fall, but to achieve this amount of output and this size of production, and now like with AI even more so, might be something that you will find intriguing.
When you talk about Adam Smith, and all of us have read about the invisible hand, yes, would you argue then that when it comes to today's large corporates, there is much more of an element of a visible hand?
So internally, inevitably, like if you look at how Walmart does their supply chain innovation or supply chain optimization, there's a lot of visible hand algorithms governing where they send the inventory, what each store is supposed to do. But I think the inside of Smith that's still super important today is, despite these large companies being large at a given point in time and being capable to organize things internally for some period of time, they do come and go. Like if you look at the largest 500 US companies 50 years ago and now, the overlap is about 30%. Only one out of the largest 10 companies in the US 50 years ago is still among the largest 10 now, and the rest is completely different, no connection at all. So the market system really selects for the winners and losers, and that's something we know the planners are not good at, and many countries have tried. Innovation actually makes that even more important. So we know that from our research that the largest companies have become larger at a given point in time, but they're not becoming more persistent. In fact, the churn of, at least in the US, the churn of the largest companies is getting faster in some ways. So the visible hand is really important for selecting who should rise and who should fall, and that's something very difficult for planners to keep track of. But to some extent, when we read Wealth of Nations, and even later on, his followers like Hayek or Friedman, they gave a sense that capitalism is some sort of an immutable system. There are these laws of capitalism or how markets work that are permanent. Whereas, quite interestingly, the Marxist described economic system as an evolutionary process. And they also, ironically, emphasized much more the importance of technological change in driving the shape of capitalism and how things would evolve, which were not so emphasized in the Wealth of Nations. One of the things that is kind of missing in the Wealth of Nations is really technology, investment, innovation, and that seems to also have shaded how Adam Smith think about other things, including banking, which you know super, super well. And his views on banking are quite shaped by facilitating exchange as opposed to facilitating investment, production, innovation. So that's an aspect of Wealth of Nations that I think requires some updates and refinement that in today's world production, investment, innovation obviously are really important drivers of economic growth, as we also know from the Nobel Prize last year.
Could it be this also just a consequence of just a historical coincidence? Because when Adam Smith wrote his thing, that was sort of roughly when industrialization started, but it hadn't started 100% as of yet. So of course his thinking was 50 or 100 years back in time, which was a completely different environment.
Yes, the context definitely mattered. He was writing at the very beginning of the first industrial revolution, and I looked up on the chatbots what were the large companies at his time, and again it was like banks and some of the trading companies. He wrote famously about the pin factory. There were kind of small workshops at the time, whereas 100 years later when Karl Marx was writing, that was towards the beginning of the second industrial revolution already, and there were like giant textile companies and coal mining and to some extent shipbuilding and railways. So he saw a very different reality. He already saw the importance of technology and also the importance of capital. And so the Wealth of Nations had some mentioning of capital, that investment in capital is already something that Adam Smith recognized a little bit, but the importance of capital was highlighted so much more in just capital, given the reality that Marx was confronting. But to quibble a little bit on Adam Smith, we give him enormous credit for being foundational for economics for 250 years, and that lasting power and his insights and the durability of his insights are really incredible, really impressive. Like if you and I think about like what can we say today that in 250 years would still be relevant, it's a really huge challenge. Yeah. So he really had a lot of foresight about many of the core elements that are still relevant today, markets and incentives. Incentives are some of the things that we know historically planners really underestimated. And companies, even though they do some planning internally, they still really have to emphasize incentives. So that insight about the importance of incentives, of incentive compatibility, of channeling individual incentives for the greater good, those were really ahead of his time, but not on the front of technology. On the front of technology, he doesn't seem to be so ahead of his time.
But then, I mean, in your research, you convincingly show that large corporates, they're just getting larger relative to the size of the economy. Yes. And this is not solely an American phenomenon, because you find something similar in many, many countries. And then that, of course, raises the question, what is it that makes this happen?
Yeah. So the specific facts that we've documented through several years of work and collecting data extensively around the world is the following: that if you look at the share of the largest companies in the US, in many European economies where we can find data, in Asia, in Australia, in Canada, the share of the largest company as a share of total economy-wide output or economy-wide capital or economy-wide profits has increased tremendously all around the world. Wherever we can get data, which we mean we want to have comprehensive data on the size distribution of all companies in an economy, oftentimes from tax statistics, sometimes from census statistics. And so that is a pretty strong requirement of representativeness. So we've been able to get such data consistently for about 100 years for 10-ish countries, and everywhere we can get data, we see these consistent patterns. And if you overlay the patterns of, say, European countries and the US and Australia and Canada, they lie on top of each other. So that's kind of surprising, at least to me, in retrospect, that, for example, 100 years ago, almost every country's top 1% of companies accounted for half of output, and now it's about 80%. A very strong amount of uniformity around the world. So that shows that large-scale production or economies of scale has become stronger. We also find in the data, quite interestingly, wherever we can find data, concentration of employment has not risen. So for employment in European countries, in the US, roughly the largest 1% of employers. The largest employers account for about half of employment throughout the past 100 years, which means the largest firms appear to get larger with capital and therefore output, but not employment. That's actually very difficult to deliver in canonical production functions where capital and labor are complements. So if you get larger in one domain, you should necessarily have other types of input, complementary input increase as well. So that really restricts the set of mechanisms that can deliver this collection of facts. That they've existed in many countries for a long period of time. It's not about country-specific demographics or country-specific regulation, because it's so uniform. And it's also not just about, say, globalization, making things different, because globalization was more specific to the past 40 years. And so it feels like something technological, but not all technological mechanisms can deliver that decoupling between larger firms getting larger with capital and output, but not with employment. So most likely there are some forces of some degree of automation going on, which of course we see and feel in life, from assembly lines to IT to AI.
Does this mean then that large corporates are better at increasing productivity in terms of output per employed person, or what is it? Or are they, generally speaking, quicker when it comes to translating innovation into something that eventually is not just innovation, something somebody has shown you can do, they actually do it?
Yeah, so take some concrete examples. Suppose assembly line comes around. There's some fixed costs around it. Not every firm would be able or willing to pay that fixed cost. And if you pay that fixed cost, it allows you to produce at a much larger scale, and these machineries oftentimes can do things instead of requiring proportionally more people. So then if companies are heterogeneous in some ways, maybe some have more financial resources or some are more productive, and they would select into the capital-intensive, scalable technology. And so that's a starting point. Then as the capital-intensive, scalable technology becomes more and more powerful, so successively we have assembly lines, and then we have IT, and then now we have AI, that will widen the gap between the large firm scale and their use of capital and the rest of the firms, but not necessarily widen the use of employment, because as we see very vividly now, AI can do things instead of what we need people to do. So that's a mechanism among all the ones that we've inspected so far that seems most promising for delivering the collection of facts.
In your work then, I mean, in order to sort of show that this is happening, and it has happened and is happening in many countries, essentially my interpretation of this is that you're talking about capital deepening in some sense.
Yes.
And if that goes on for quite some time, then you have more and more capital, and the labor force is more or less constant, but produce a lot more output. And in order to show this empirically, you start at the sort of super micro level, because you have to collect data from individual companies, and then you move to certain sectors of the economy to the extent data is available in about 10 countries that you mentioned. But then ultimately at the end of the day, and maybe this is sort of wearing my old macro glasses, what's your view on what does this do to the macroeconomics of things, or broadly speaking, the function, in an economic sense, of course, the functioning of a country, if you aggregate up this?
Yes, so let me say a few of the implications, starting from the more specific and then go to the more general and maybe metaphysical. For the very specific implications, say from the central bank's perspective, if you have think about transmission of monetary policy, right now, if you want to see the impact of monetary policy on things like investment or output, it's really what the largest firms do that matter. But the effect of monetary policy on employment is going to depend more on the effect on the small and medium-sized firms. And then the mechanism of transmission could be different because the smaller firms may be more financially constrained. So to affect employment, you probably need to affect more the margins that matter for the smaller firms. But to affect output and investment, it's what the larger firms do that matters. So that may lead to some decoupling in the outcomes. So for example, you may see in a recovery that investment is doing well and even output might be doing well because the larger firms, their balance sheets are kind of strong and they can recover reasonably quickly, whereas the small firms, their balance sheets are weak, they're financially constrained, and then employment recovery may lag behind. On a side note, which is somewhat related to capital deepening and automation, in today's world, there's a speculation that my collaborators are working on separately, which is if traditionally we think about monetary stimulation as stimulating employment and output simultaneously. But what if nowadays stimulus leads to firms doing more automation? And that may actually not show up on the employment numbers as much. So that may actually lead to some interesting divergence in the effects of monetary stimulation on the different macro outcomes that central banks track. Now, another type of specific implication is if, for example, the 1,000 largest US companies account for half of the output for many of the things, like even for carbon emission, it's fairly concentrated. The largest emitters account for like vast majority of the emissions. So even the policies of individual companies can do much good or much harm for the economy, and then therefore the governance of these large firms matters a lot. And then for the more general implications, this is one of the ways to reflect the change of production function over time. So you asked just now, why do we see this? And it's most likely a reflection of the evolution of the production function. And it's one of the ways to reflect the importance of automation and economies of scale in the economy. And that can also affect, even the very basic things of how economists think about production function. Interestingly, and now I'm not advocating for the Marxist view, but he actually really highlighted the notion of centralization of capital, and that he kind of loosely predicted that this rise of large firms is an inevitability as a consequence of technology, and in particular, the concentration of capital as opposed to employment. He then drew a very radical conclusion to your question of the policy relevance. They drew a radical conclusion, which is planning is ultimately inevitable because you have technology that will get stronger and stronger in economies of scale, and then if the technology is then really only operated by the tycoons, then that's not very beneficial for the society, and then therefore the government should do it. There are many logical leaps in that conclusion.
But that's kind of opposite your empirical reflection that you have a lot of churning.
Yes, so that's what he missed. That's one of the very important things that Marx missed. Another important thing that Marx missed in jumping to that conclusion is that scale doesn't come for free. It's not that like you can build OpenAI or Microsoft just out of scratch without anything. You need financing, you need to raise money. And in the US, raising money then gradually means diffusion of ownership. So for example, a lot of the VCs are essentially backed by pension funds, and a lot of the money that you raise on the equity markets are from equity mutual funds, people's retirement savings. So Marx thought that one tycoon is one company, but today actually the largest US companies, if you look at their shareholders, there's no single large shareholder. Nowadays, except for Walmart, there's still some influence of the Walton family for the largest techs. Their founders account for less than 10% of the ownership, and the largest owners, to the extent there are like the collection of the index funds. And all of us own in our portfolio some amount of all the US companies. So that diffusion of ownership also helps maintaining the balance a little bit, not perfect. There are so many problems with the US with inequality and distribution, obviously, but that's another countervailing force. And yes, I agree that with the speed of innovation getting faster and faster, the invisible hand actually seems to be the most robust way so far that we know to select the winners and losers. And so maybe the triumph of Marx, to some extent, is he recognized the importance of technology, but he missed the broader ecosystem that governs the development of technology. But Smith appreciated that ecosystem.
But in both cases, I also think that back then, and this is not to criticize at all, it's just a reflection, and that is that limited liability companies weren't that many.
Yes.
And the financial sector was rudimentary.
Yes.
And now when you talk about companies getting bigger and bigger, at the same time you say that depending on the financial sector, or depending on how we have chosen to construct the financial sector, if I describe it in that way, we can end up with solutions where on the one hand we have big companies, but they don't have sort of one owner, they have many owners. What does this imply when it comes to the financial sector and how we choose to design the financial sector? Because ultimately you have to have some kind of a regulatory framework, and it takes rules and it takes political decisions. So the financial sector doesn't appear out of thin air. Somebody has to have some kind of an idea what financial sector we would like to have. And if you combine those two, the big corporates, with what I just said, what's your reaction? Where should we be heading?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And to me, when I reflect on the shape of our economy today, I think the financial sector is a super important element for maintaining the balance of capitalism in the following ways. One is it is really important for powering innovation and dynamism and the replacement of whoever should be the dominant company who produces the best product. If there is good financing for whoever has good ideas, then we can empower the whoever has new ideas to challenge the incumbents. And at the same time, financial sector, especially the development of retirement savings and pensions, allows the diffusion of ownership. So while production may get concentrated at a given point in time, ownership can become more diffuse. When I looked at the data that people have put together on household financial ownership, it's quite interesting that the share of even the bottom 90% in total equity ownership has increased very substantially over the past 100 years since the beginning of the 20th century. And of all asset categories, housing and fixed income and so on and so forth, the type of asset that the bottom 90% owns much more now than before as a share of total is equities because of pensions. So they are participating more in getting the gains from the capitalists to some extent. Again, that's not perfect, and there is still a lot of things that U.S. needs to do much better in balancing the system. But if we think about like an extreme case, if AI really takes over and capital becomes so much more powerful, then to some extent the ultimate solution probably has to be that we all should be capitalists so that we can benefit from the fruits of capital. That all of us, by participating in financial system, by investing in financial system, can benefit from advancement in capital. So of course, it's probably a long way before we actually reach that limit case, but I think financial inclusion in the broad sense of people actually participating in the financial system, getting the gains from financial investment in that process, powering innovation and dynamism is really important.
If you look at the 10 countries then where you have the data set,
yeah.
Have you reflected on then to what extent pension systems and how households go about saving differ?
Not me personally, but the AFA, the American Finance Association presidential address by David Sharfstein, is a really insightful piece about how the structure of the pension system shapes capital markets. He shows correlational evidence. Of course, it's very difficult to do natural experiments in this case. He shows that countries with more privately funded pensions and less pay-as-you-go system, they have much better developed capital markets. And U.S. is one of the countries with much more private involvement. I read that Sweden too, people have, at least through pensions, a decent amount of participation in capital markets. And Sweden, as we know, among European countries, is one of the leaders in innovation too. Anecdotally, it seems to line up. And so actually to circle back to Adam Smith, I also read his comments about, like, for example, banking, and he is somewhat famously associated with, say, the real bills doctrine that you lend against essentially accounts receivables. And in that aspect, he also really didn't see the importance of financing for supporting investment and innovation or production. He really saw finance as, and again, a way to facilitate exchange, whereas in today's world, finance really plays a super important role in powering advancement and economic growth, which is also something highlighted by the Draghi report for European competitiveness. A lot of it is about how to improve the financial system in Europe to support more venture funding, to support more innovative investment.
Would you argue then that if I refer to the Draghi report, or the Lehrer report for that matter, because the content is about the same, that what we're really talking about here is not just lending from banks, we're really talking about equity?
So that's also a very interesting question. Traditionally, we think about banks as really taking debt claims that they care about the downside, they really care about the upside. But as we see the emerging fields of lending, for example, private credit and so on and so forth, more and more forms of banking actually are geared towards also supporting the cash flows of companies. They're much more willing to participate in restructuring, not liquidating companies, but supporting their continuing operations. And in that process, they're lending more and more to the intangible economy, to, for example, software companies, companies that are more data intensive as opposed to physical asset intensive. We're already seeing that shift in banking as well. Of course, that again doesn't come for free. You can't really lend on the merit of the company's operations without monitoring. So that goes back to the insight of my colleague Doug Diamond, that monitoring is really an important function of banking, and maybe banks or the banking system or lending more generally going forward needs to leverage more and more on the monitoring side, and then with the advancement of data, that's becoming more and more feasible. Of course, equity investment is quite important as well, and the Draghi report and the like really emphasized the importance of VCs for funding ideas that, 1 out of 20 may succeed. That's not what banks can do, true. And then there are a lot of interesting discussions about what are the environments that will empower VC financing. So in summary, yes, banks can't really lend against moonshot ideas that have very little probability of success, but there are many businesses that have good prospects, but not so much physical assets, and it's important for banks to develop the capability of supporting those businesses, and for those very wild ideas like SpaceX and the like, of course, equity financing is important.
You mentioned SpaceX, and that takes me to really kind of a forward-looking, because you have data that goes 100 years back. In some cases, it's possible actually to go a little bit more, even further back in time, and you show how these corporations just get bigger and bigger. Now, if you sort of think about it another 50 years into the future, where are we heading?
Oh, well, first, disclaimer, it's not that we think that large firms are good, it's they have become, as the data show, a part of our reality because of technological change.
That is correct.
So
That's
on.
correct.
So
Yep.
we do need to think about how to maintain balance in society in that world. Even our world today, like there's a lot of grievances or discontent of the big techs and concerns that they may become too powerful, too influential over people's lives. And if we think that technologies like AI may even amplify the economies of scale, we do need to think about, again, maintaining balance. I think the development of financial system is one of the pillars, and competition and fostering dynamism by empowering the ideas of challengers is another important pillar. But even in the space of AI, we see very quick, in a way, ebbs and flows of who's a leader. A year ago, we were all using ChatGPT, and today, actually, at least in my cursory use for my own coding and research, Gemini does much better for classification, Cloud does much better for writing code from scratch, and OpenAI and ChatGPT's functions are the least good, and I don't really use them anymore other than like planning travel. So there's a very quick turnaround, and I think we want to keep that going. But there is, I think, a very substantive concern. Like Draghi report reads as if U.S. invests 3 times as much in R&D than Europe. That's great, and we should all invest more in R&D. But then these investments do have implications that may be difficult for societies to swallow, at least within a short amount of time. In the US, we are already seeing employment in the information sector declining by like 4 or 5% over the past 2 years. And so every time an industrial revolution comes around, there's rebalancing involved. So when technology automated agriculture, there was some adjustment, but ultimately we were able to move on to manufacturing reasonably okay. When then manufacturing got automated, we then moved on to services in the aggregate kind of in an okay sense. But of course, you see in the US Rust Belt and people left behind, and very dear consequences for those people directly involved in this transition. Now we see in the US, for example, healthcare employment is going up, leisure employment is going up. There are still things that people need to do. But in making this transition, what is the right system to facilitate is important.
Highly, highly, highly relevant. I went to high school on the wrong side of the railroad tracks in Saginaw, Michigan. And all of it is gone when it comes to the industry, the way it looked back then. And that, of course, raises these very, very difficult societal issues when you need to move labor from one sector to another.
Yeah. So in 50 years, well, even in 5 years, we probably will see very substantial impact of the current technological wave. Yesterday, there was a event with Chicago Booth alums about the impact of AI, and at least within our alums, the past 12 months, AI adoption really had a dramatic change. Like 6 months ago, when we met with the same group, people were saying, oh, we're using some AI. And yesterday, everybody was saying AI had such a tremendous impact on how they work, and making them productive. We're not seeing that in the statistics yet, but they're really saying it's making things go much faster and we ourselves are seeing like really magical effect of how cloud can code very non-trivial things from scratch. And so they're going to save our times. And then an interesting question is what do we use our time for? Is economic research getting more creative, and are we creating more insights just because we've saved time on coding? That's an interesting question. And also, what will be the transitional effect and how people adapt to it will be an interesting question. I do think there are many still like really important human functions like entertainment, leisure, healthcare, and so on and so forth, so that will absorb employment. In terms of scale, which we started with, scaling is such a buzzword today. Scale probably will be very important still going forward. It's almost by design that these new technologies have low marginal costs and high fixed cost. It's to some extent probably also what we seek for. At any business, even for our research too, we want to do more things quickly at low cost, reliably, and algorithms inherently are better at doing that, at replicating at scale, at being able to expand a lot of things very quickly. So maybe we ourselves push technology in this direction. So I don't think scale will go away. It probably will be enhanced for these intrinsic reasons that we seek. We seek to do things reliably over a large span. And so then, again, that goes to the question of how do we maintain balance in this case. And this type of scaling of reliability, of covering a large span is better done by capital. So then it goes back to then who gets to benefit from the capital, and the theme that financial markets, I think, is going to be super important for spreading the gains of capital to a larger group of people. And then in the far future, I think we probably will continue to see, again, the inside of Smith being really important for creating the ecosystem, even if many of the implementation is done in a more top-down way, that information can be processed more effectively by things like algorithms, as opposed to like through just price signals. But in this broad ecosystem of determining who's the winner, who's the loser, who has the power and who has control, the inside of Adam Smith, I think, will stay. Even though these days people look at like East Asia and say, oh, maybe there's some triumph or victory of industrial policy, but you know, industrial policy succeeds maybe less than 50% of the time, and we see the success cases. And industrial policy is also kind of risky. There's no guarantee that governments will always be focused on promoting growth, and we see governments historically easily deviate from the goal of promoting growth, whereas the capitalist system, despite all the caveats and so on, profit incentives inherently drive people towards growth and producing products and services, as opposed to, you know, pursuing political agendas of other sorts.
That takes us full circle back to where we started. And let me put it like this then. Who was right? Was it Smith, Marx, or Hayek? And I was actually here in this building when Hayek was here and received the Nobel Prize. And
How was that?
well, it was remarkable. It was actually remarkable to be in the lecture hall and hear him talk. He was, of course, pretty much on the old side, and I was extremely much a young man back then. But it was, of course, highly interesting and something worth remembering, particularly now when I read what you have written and on all the references that you come up with. But anyway, who was right? Smith,
So let me
Marx,
first
or Hayek?
answer a specific question related to Hayek. I read the Nobel lectures once upon a time for fun, like the history of Nobel lectures, to also get a sense of how our understanding of the world has evolved over time. And it's interesting that for the first 10 or 20 years, there were many Nobel Prizes dedicated to ideas that were somewhat related to planning. And one thing that I find interesting is, so Marx, for example, saw large companies being successful and extrapolated towards central planning. So the visible hand, like Walmart, is powerful for things that require a lot of repeated coordination, and so in companies it makes sense. But then when people actually did research about planning, it's often about the allocation of consumption, which is not what planning actually is inherently good at. When my parents were growing up, they got like these quotas of, you know, how much rice and vinegar you can buy and so on. For allocating consumption to consumers, that requires knowing the preferences and tastes of many diffuse people, and it's kind of very one-off. In production lines, there's good reasoning that price is not the best signal. There's a lot of coordination that we need to do that needs to be conveyed through words and rules and processes. But like for buying rice and vinegar, that's a very different business. And so in that context, price signal is very powerful in many ways, and whereas in production, price signal is much more constrained in many ways. So I actually felt kind of curious why when people were looking at the visible hand, they were not only looking at the visible hand, or maybe actually less so the visible hand in orchestrating consumption, but they actually spent a lot of time looking at the visible hand for orchestrating consumption. And that's what Hayek said was kind of misguided. The visible hand is not good for orchestrating allocation of consumption. Now, so he's right in that sense in recognizing the information problem of society. He, at least in my reading, again, the ardent followers Hayek may disagree, when he wrote about the information limitation of society, it was kind of very general. He wrote as if there's limitation of information in all corners of society, whereas now as we see, like Ericsson is solving the information of the problem of society in some parts of the world. So that's more, I think, in the production part. In the consumption part, I've seen that the Singaporean government using AI algorithms to design optimal consumption coupons for households. Maybe that will have some effect, but by and large, I believe in the power of the visible hand. And so back to Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Interestingly, over the past 250 years, our societies and capitalism to some extent have organically channeled us to a paradoxical unification, convergence, or at least a mixture of the ideas of both people that combine them, but of course also defy them in interesting ways. So we start seeing, even in the most capitalistic, market-driven societies, organically, the emergence of planning not directed by governments, but by companies on the production side. The evolution of technology has enabled more top-down processing of information. So there's some degree of planning in firms, not by governments. And then there's also this diffusion of ownership, now, of course not towards full communism, but today we own a lot more of the American enterprises for the average household than 100 years ago. So some amount of common ownership, again, not driven by the government, but driven by the development of financial market, by markets and the visible hand. And then we still maintain this very important broad ecosystem that selects for dynamism in society. So in this mixture of Smith and Marx, each of them has some insights to contribute. Marx for the importance of technology in shaping the evolution of dynamism, of capitalism, that capitalism is not static and it's going to evolve, the shape is going to evolve with technological change, but definitely not to full planning, like for all the steps that he skipped, that he missed incentives, that he missed many of the foundations for dynamism. And Smith, we maybe supplement his insights with that his insights can even apply, even though the forces of the visible hand are becoming more and more important. But of course, we add to his framework the importance of innovation, production, investment, and then we need to think about, back to what we discussed, how to maintain balance in this world of really rapid innovation and change.
So you're kind of saying that in the real world, it's rarely 0 or 1.
Yes.
It's a bit of many different things.
Yes, I think one of the fun things about economics is over time we come to appreciate the connections of many things that are seemingly unalike. That even though Adam Smith and Karl Marx traditionally are framed as two completely separate paradigms of two very different ideologies, when you actually think carefully about it, there are inevitable connections, and the world has become a mixture of the two. And capitalism has absorbed some of the elements of Marxism, but has shaped those elements in its own ways. And that's important, and I think a lot of economics is to connect the dots and to absorb ideas from different traditions and understand how the combination is a very powerful way to understand the essence of our world.
Well, Yueran, thank you so much for illuminating us and for taking us through 250 years plus another 50 years into the future of economic evolution, if I call it that. So thank you very, very much for this most fascinating conversation.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.